Did it again. Hey, everybody. There. Okay. Hey, everybody. Miss Lynch here. Welcome back. So this is the second half of chapter 3. I uploaded the first half earlier. I was feeling a little emotional whenever I did it, so thanks for bearing with me through that. Anyway, let's get back into this chapter, and yeah, I stopped a little bit more, like not quite halfway, because my battery was running low. I was scared I wouldn't be able to upload this video at all, or that video at all. But anyway. Okay, so last time we were talking about, we were talking about slavery, but the last thing we were looking at tobacco farms in the Chesapeake. Okay, that's right. So Chesapeake slavery is where we will start off. So that is the first slide you see here. And I said that I wanted to start with this because 1619 is such an important date. Okay, so the first African slaves arrived in the British colonies, so the Chesapeake, in 1619 via a Dutch ship. All right, and last time I said that. There is the 1619 project that came out last year because that was the 400th anniversary of the establishment of slavery in North America. So New York Times put together this whole project. And yeah, if you guys are doing your research about that, I really encourage you to look into that. The 1619 project by the New York Times. It was curated by Nicole Hannah Jones, or Hannah Nicole Jones, and I'm sorry, it's one or the other, and I do not know off the top of my head. But it is an excellent project. There's so much information in there. You should definitely look into it if that is in your area of stuff that you're researching or stuff that you're interested in, because that is, there's so much information there that it is worth looking into, absolutely. Okay, so 1619, this happens in the Chesapeake. So the next few bullet points here are ways that the already limited rights of slaves in this area were just being picked apart even further. Taxes being imposed on them, for example. Any sort of rights that they had in courts to be able to testify against someone or to be able to sue, that's taken away. Okay, so this is just kind of illustrating that. Okay. All right, and those kind of hit on what we talked about last time. Okay, so 1662, the Virginia House of Burgesses, they were governing body there, okay, passed a law stating that if a child was born to an enslaved parent and one free parent, the status of the child would go to the mother. So, going off of that, this made the sexual abuse of slave women profitable for slaveholders because any children that these women had would then remain the property of their owner. So there's a lot of sexual violence that will come out of this, and children being born into slavery out of this specific situation. Okay, let's see. 1667. Oh yeah, this goes back to some things that we've said before. So 1667, there's a law passed decreeing that religious conversion, remember you would get your citizenship before, but religious conversion did not release a slave from bondage, and their child, the child of interracial relationships, remained illegitimate in the scope of citizenship, okay? So this is different than how the French and Spanish had approached things like that, okay? All right, so our next section here, Afro-European relations. So, class in the Chesapeake. We have a lot of small farmers, and then our indentured servants and slave plantations run by slave labor continue to grow. All right. And we know that indentured servants and slaves, regardless of ethnicity, worked together and fraternized. Okay. And that is evident in the fact that there were laws being passed during this whole point in time that specifically forbade people from doing just that, fraternizing, hanging out. Okay. So this shows how kind of strong those bonds were because laws were being made to try to prevent it. Okay. Sorry, that was a kind of roundabout way, but hopefully you get what I'm saying. Okay. All right. Okay, so runaway slaves who had come more recently from Africa would often run away in groups and establish villages on the frontier. So they would go further inland west. Okay, and slaves who were born in America were often likely to run away alone and try to pass as free men. So this is a pattern that we'll kind of see over time. Okay. All right. So, 1698, South Carolina passed it's called a deficiency law. This required plantation owners to have at least one European male servant for every 6 African slaves that they had. And the point of this was for the European indentured servant to superintend, and I quote, any sort of uprisings or any problems, okay? So they were really meant to be kind of this buffer between slaves and owners. Okay, so put indentured servants in the middle. So this created distinctions of status as a means to separate servants and slaves. Yeah, as I said, as a way to prevent any uprisings, and to serve as a buffer. All right. Okay. So between 1680, 1700, African slave labor surpassed indentured servitude, which had kind of been the model. And this had to do with declining death rates, which I talked about last time, okay? I'm going to move through that a little bit. Okay, so 1705, again, Virginia House of Burgesses enacted a new slave code stating that slaves were property and completely subject to their owners. I said before, they had some limited rights, being able to testify in court, stuff like that. So now slaves could be bought, sold, leased, fought over, and passed on to future generations. And so that 1705 is what is kind of considered to be the creation of a true slave society. 1675, this goes back to, the Pueblo Revolt. We were talking about the Yamasee Uprising and the Creek people. So King Philip's War is another uprising of indigenous peoples. So 1675, this is of the Wampanoag people. And there were attacks placed on farms and settlements that were beginning to kind of move into indigenous land. And so Metacom, who's the Wampanoag leader, or King Philip, which is how we get this name, he led this uprising. And so that starts in 1675. By the next year, indigenous forces had attacked nearly half of New England's towns, which there were 90 at that point. And of those 90, 12 were completely destroyed. And it pushed that line of settlement. Like I said, people were moving in, and that's what caused the tension. This pushed that line of settlement back to the coast. Okay. All right. So mid-1676, there's then a counterattack by colonists. So those who had been pushed back, there's a counterattack. Metacom is executed. We have indigenous villages that are then destroyed. And the Wampanoag people were captured and either killed or sold into slavery in the West Indies. And that included Metacom's wife and 9-year-old son, who were then sent to Barbados. Okay. So specifically looking at King Philip's War, this established the idea of first Americans being, quote, savage in the European mindset. And this specifically would be used as an example later on as justification for the expansion of European settlement in North America. Okay. So where are we at? 10 minutes, we're doing okay. All right. So let's look at Bacon's Rebellion for just a few. Again, 1676, same year as King Philip's War. This is in Virginia, regarding their governor, William Berkeley, who was pretty corrupt. He had an alliance with the wealthiest tobacco planters there, and he would reward people who followed him. All right, so bribing. Tobacco farming starts to move inland, all right, away from the coast. Berkeley's allies get the best land, and this left freed servants, so those who had completed their servitude, to work as tenant farmers on the frontier. And I think I get into this in a future lecture too, but I will just tell you that is how we get the term hillbilly, because the rich people who were able to get all the land, it's nice and flat and open and easy to farm. And the land that nobody wants is up in the hills with lots of trees and rocks, and it's difficult. So they would send our poor farmers up to the hills to get that land. So over time, that's where the term hillbilly comes from. So you'll see that in a lecture somewhere, but I just thought I would go ahead and mention it. Okay? All right. Sorry. So still looking at Virginia, over the 1670s, poverty starts to rise, and voting rights are restricted to landowners. And so there's just a lot of conflict between our classes. So Berkeley, the governor, he wanted to remain peaceful with their indigenous neighbors, and he refused to allow any people in Virginia to settle on indigenous land, which angered people because they wanted to do just that. They wanted to move on and take as much land and property as possible. Okay, so there is a minor conflict between the Doeg people and colonists over some stolen hogs. And settlers then demanded that Berkeley authorize them, permit them to lay siege to the Doeg people and destroy their presence and able to open up land, right, for their own settlement. So Berkeley refused, and then this leads to a series of massacres against indigenous people. Started by indigenous people. That then leads to our rebellion that is led by Nathaniel Bacon. So, Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy planter and was against Berkeley's views. So Bacon supported small farmers, landless men, indentured servants, and slaves. And he promised that all who joined him would get access to indigenous lands. It's a way to get those numbers in. And again, that year, he... what am I even trying to say here? So that same year, gathered an armed force against Governor Berkeley and his, quote, protected and darling Indians, end quote. And so Berkeley tells them to disband. Bacon refuses, and then they marched and burned Jamestown. All right. So Berkeley flees. Bacon takes over Virginia for a while, and basically until 1,000 soldiers are sent over from England. Right. So this idea of civil war among Europeans frightened Virginia's elite or wealthy class, and so they took dramatic steps to consolidate their power and improve their image after Bacon's death. So this, in order to prevent further uprisings. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next slide. So a riotous time. So this is just examples of social unrest that's happening across British North America. All right, so lots of revolts in cities from landless people. There are bread riots because people are starving. Yeah, the naval riot of 1747. And so this just kind of shows that, stuff was going on. And this last bullet point I think is very important because this kind of gets missed a lot. But so class conflicts are often lost in history because there's an emphasis on the external struggle for independence during the Revolution. So whenever we think of the colonies in the colonial era, it's, oh, well, yeah, this gets to the American Revolution and there's, everything was fine. But there is a lot going on that it was not a happy time. Okay. Which then takes us to the Salem witch trials. All right. The European witch hunts had been going on for 400 years in Europe. So whenever this kind of makes its way over to Salem, it's the tail end of that. Okay, so 1692, beginning of January, in Salem Village and the surrounding towns, this spread to Essex County, in which several girls were afflicted, again, quote unquote, with physical fits that were brought on by witchcraft. I know some people are doing the research topics on that, so you guys can, I'll let you get into all of that research on your own, but I will try to keep things moving. But basically, your own perspective on witchcraft and if these girls were afflicted or not, that can be up to you, all right? But so, accusations in Salem start flying about who's a witch, who's doing what. All of the accusers were women and girls, mostly teenage girls. And all of this spreads through town via gossip, okay? And by the end of it, which this goes through October of 1692, 19 people were hanged. Actually, I guess I should say 18 people were hanged. And Giles Corey, does Giles Corey make our 19th or our 20th? I think he makes the 19th person. He was flattened by stones, so crushed. I think it's 19 total. So 18 people were hanged. Giles Corey was crushed, I do believe. Okay. Anyway, as a result of that, the Massachusetts governor dissolved the Salem court. They said that's enough. Like I said, this ended in October. And this really brings in, which we'll see later, but it brings in the scientific revolution. And our cover photo today is from the Salem witch trials. Okay, so you can see there's supposed to be lightning bolts, and somebody is afflicted and knocked to the ground. But anyway, again, some Victorian art for you, romanticizing. Okay, but really, okay. Looking at colonial America as a whole, like I said, there's lots of unrest going on. This is not a peaceful time per se. And also the population kind of explodes during this era. So 1700s, we're now into the 1700s. 70,000 English migrants come over. 145,000 Scottish and Ulster, which Ulster's the northern part of Ireland. Okay, 85,000 Germans. You guys don't need to know these numbers specifically. I just want you to kind of think of how large they are. All right. All of these people are coming over to flee religious persecution, which is our vibe of the day, right? But so hundreds of thousands of people coming over, really starting to settle in New York, right? New York kind of becomes a place for settlers, Pennsylvania, and then the backcountry, which is central Pennsylvania and south into the Carolinas. So the backcountry is the most rapidly growing region of this time, and grain and livestock were their kind of main focuses. All right, I got some more numbers for you here if you want to look at them. But yeah, so 1700, the population of Mexico City is up to 100,000. Boston's at 6,000 and New York's at 4,500. So they're still, relatively small compared to other places like Mexico City, but that's okay. They're growing. Okay, people often lived and worshipped in homogenous communities. Although American society, there we go, was already more diverse than Britain pretty early on. Okay, there's the rise of port cities during this time, and Philadelphia becomes the capital of the New World. All right, it is the third busiest port behind London and Liverpool, and it will be a hot spot throughout this point in time, especially getting into the Revolution, right? Okay. We are moving right along. Okay, and I'm actually going to go through this one a little quick. Please read through it, though, but this is just more ways that, Europeans were being pretty terrible to indigenous peoples. So there is the walking purchase of 1737. This is in Pennsylvania against the Lenni Lenape people. And basically this agreement was signed saying that settlers could settle as much land as one person could walk in a day. And what do? They hire somebody who's a runner to get more land. Okay? So it's just more stuff like this, right? European populations are growing. Okay. Our social class system is establishing itself, and those divisions are becoming more apparent. Okay. On that note, poverty, oh my gosh, I'm really losing it, you guys. Poverty, there we go, becomes more evident, especially in our cities, as those riots are happening, like I said. Also, so a growing number of slaves lived in impoverished conditions. Like I said, not that their conditions were great to start with, but we had some limited rights in some aspects. And so that is just really disappearing in any way, okay? So our European population expanded, access to land diminished rapidly, and forces many into the cities, which is what happened in London and was the problem to begin with. Okay, so this is already happening in our new cities. Okay, especially Boston, Philadelphia, like I said, but Boston too. Poverty line increases. Okay, so yeah, by 1750, half of the wealth was owned by 10% of the population, which whenever we were talking about those first families to settle New York, I said, I forgot how many millions of acres, 2 or 10, it's one or the other now, I can't remember, but that was divided between 5 families. Okay, so same things, happening kind of across the board. And then there is the establishment of workhouses to help all of these people who are flooding into the cities that need help. All right. Okay, so women in the colonies. Okay, so we know that looking at indigenous communities and the way their ways of life were destructed, this obviously affected women too. Many indigenous communities were matriarchal, so it followed the mother's lineage. This is the opposite of the European model, which is patriarchal, okay? So the way of life that is changed for indigenous women is kind of like twofold, all right? We know that African women endured lives of brutality and exploitation. Okay, already, going back to Virginia and the law about children who are born and their status being reliant on their mother, which, like we said, that opens up this door for a lot of sexual exploitation of these women. Okay, so we know that. The colonial period is often regarded as a golden age for European women who might have immigrated. They were able to contribute to the economy and own businesses. They did not, for the most part, have control of their resources. Okay, let's see. Okay, so looking at our Yemen farmers, which, if you remember, Yemen farmers are smaller class of farmers that do not rely on slave labor and rely on their own families, often with their dozen children. Okay, but so independence of the small farmer was really reliant on, like I said, the labor of their families, so women and children, and the high birth rate in part reflected that need. So we can see how large these families were and kind of apply that need for labor. Okay, so populations start to grow, death rates start to decline as communities establish themselves. So family life is able to stabilize. And then here I have, this is just kind of listed, kind of daily duties for women in the home. So it was things like cooking, cleaning, sewing, making butter goes in with cooking, but food prep work, and agricultural chores. And going with the lower death rate, this applies to children too. So a lower infant mortality rate meant that there was more time for child rearing, so child raising, and these domestic chores. Okay, women still there's quite a bit of time for us before we get into education opening up to women, so there's still a lack of access in regards to that. So, yes, these women during this time would go on to lead lives of hard work and child raising. So, although I said the death rate is declining as our communities are establishing it themselves, women's death rate is still very high throughout all of history because of multiple births. That really opens up the opportunity for a lot of things to go wrong. So women will kind of always have a high death rate throughout history till we kind of get into the modern era, right? Let's see. Yeah, I think it's in your book. I don't know which page, but Carolina actually advertised that women who came to the colony would get an increase in fertility and that their births would be less painful. So there's that. Had something to do with the ear. All right. Okay, talking about education and work. Midwives, this was an essential role for women. So if you don't know what a midwife is, that's fine. They deliver babies historically, so at home. So this was kind of an essential role. I said kind of. It was an essential role for women. In our cities, we saw a lot of poorer women working as seamstresses. I also said that they were able to women were able to operate businesses fairly easier compared to other times. So we have shopkeepers, female shopkeepers. And between 1740 and 1775 in Boston, there were 90 female-owned businesses. Of how many total businesses, I don't know, but here you go. Okay, and this is our last point. So 3% of working women in the 1700s in New England were enslaved African women. Whenever we get to the South, we will see larger numbers. But so that's just kind of what's going on a little further north. Okay, so let me just look real quick here. Okay, I think that that is actually where I want to leave off, women in the colonies. So we see these divisions. Okay, so this is kind of starting to lead us up to, like I said, we're in the 1700s now. Spoiler alert, whenever we get to the 1770s, we're going to have a revolution, okay? But so we are working our way up to that point in time. So chapter 4 is going to get us there, and then chapter 5, I'll let loose. But so that is chapter 3. Yeah, this takes us up to 1750, so we are getting close to the revolution, actually. Alrighty. So that is the second half of chapter 3. If you guys have any questions, feel free to give me a shout. Otherwise, I will be back with chapter 4. I'll talk to you soon. Okay, bye.